My name is Ned Bowman, and I'm a project biologist and outreach coordinator for Great Basin Bird Observatory. In this series, I'm going to talk about sparrow identification. Here in Nevada, we have an abundance of sparrows, and depending on where and when you are, identifying them can be quite challenging. In fact, there are so many and so much variety that we have put together a 4-part series to cover them all. And this series will be primarily focused on identification and field marks, as well as vocalizations, with only a small amount of background info on natural history. There's a few sparrow species that have very specific breeding habitats, and some are more general. Most are general in terms of migration and wintering habitat, so knowing what to expect can be very useful, but should never be used to explicitly rule any identification out. One nice thing about our sparrows is that not a single species is dimorphic. That is, the adult males and females of every species look the same. So with that, I'll begin part 1, the Towhees. Our first sparrow, the spotted towhee, is a year-round resident throughout the state of Nevada, and you can see in the map on the right where it resides in the rest of the country and the rest of the year. They are easily identified by the black upper parts with white speckles on the wings, rufous sides, and white belly. They have a few distinct habitat types that they use, including montane shrubland, seen in the big photo on the right, lowland riparian thick shrubbery, seen on the upper left, and pinyon juniper woodland, seen on the lower left. And they do seem to use these habitats year-round, though I have noticed them on winter surveys in locations I do not generally find them on breeding season surveys, which suggests they do move around a bit. Specifically, I'm thinking of Las Vegas Wash and Warm Springs Natural Area. Each year I detect a few in the winter, and I've never detected one in the spring or summer months here. I suspect these areas are just too warm for them to breed in. So I don't need to go into the ID of these guys too much, because there really isn't anything to confuse them with. Even a quick glimpse of the not too graceful flight style, quickly flying low to the ground from one bush to another, with those flashing white tail corners is really all it takes. They're very distinctly plumage bird, and those white corners are super obvious in flight. They're almost always on or near the ground, and they kick litter around like thrashers and fox sparrows, so the noise of that can be a good cue to their presence. And I know I just said that none of our North American sparrows are dimorphic, but there's an exception to every rule, I suppose. Adult female spotted towhees are more of a brown or gray than the jet black of the adult male. So on the left there, you can see the bird on the top is a male, and the bird below is a female. But those differences are very subtle, and even weird lighting can totally throw you off on that. So that's not the best field mark to use. The juveniles are also worth mentioning. That big photo on the right there, they're brown and streaky all over like most juvenile sparrows, but they're sort of chunky size, and that long tail structure will give them away as spotted towhees. Just because they're not necessarily always on the radar for a bird skulking in the bushes, so good one to have in the back pocket. As I said before, the spotted towhee is a skulky bird, much more often heard than seen, so learning its vocalizations can be a very useful cue to its presence. Having some issues with sound quality here, so unfortunately these vocalizations are rather quiet. But the first one I want to talk about is the call note, which is a mew call, maybe reminiscent of the green-tailed towhee, but it's much harsher, more of a scold. And so again, it's fairly quiet, but I'll play that for you now. And that's a call note used by both the male and female. The next vocalization I want to mention is the song, and I have 2 different recordings. One is similar to what you would hear throughout the Pacific Northwest and in northwestern Nevada. The towhees, spotted towhees, sound like this. And the second recording is more like what you would hear throughout the rest of the state and in the Rocky Mountains and Intermountain West region. So this first recording is what the birds in northwestern Nevada sound like. And now I'll play a recording of what you would hear throughout the rest of the state. So you can hear there's a bit more going on in that second recording. They're using those harsh intro notes. There's just a bit more variability there. And again, apologies for the quiet recordings. Xenocanto.org is a great website to find recordings of birds on, and I've got that typed out on the final slide of the presentation for those of you who are curious. So our next sparrow is the green-tailed towhee. It's an uncommon migrant, but super common breeder throughout the state. And again, there on the right, you can see its range map throughout its range there. Mostly wintering in Mexico and summering and breeding in the intermountain western United States. They absolutely love montane shrubland in the edges of pinyon juniper woodlands. So once you get to an elevation above where sagebrush dominates, where you start to get a bit more diversity in the shrubs, these guys are really everywhere. I can recall countless surveys that just begin with a deafening chorus of green-tailed towhees coming from every direction. And like I said before, they're a spring and summer bird here, and they spend their winters in Mexico. But for how abundant they are on breeding grounds, they're not particularly common on migration, and it's possibly because they use their breeding habitat to migrate through primarily. But that being said, I do find them on migration in lowland riparian areas, so they certainly do use these cottonwoods and willows along valley floors to some extent. Green-tailed towhees are a readily identifiable bird. They have a bright white throat and contrasting dark black mustache lines that form a very distinct pattern. They have that bright red cap and bright green on the wings and tail feathers, which provide great field marks to identify them from any angle. But as you'll see in a minute, it's not the visual field marks that are tough for these guys. They have very complex vocalizations, and that is where the identification challenges come in. Like I said before, they have a sweet and soft mew call, similar to the spotted towhee, but rather distinct, and it sounds like this. So that's the call, and you can see how it's similar to that spotted towhee, but a lot sweeter and softer, not such a harsh scold. And I just wish I could say the same for the song, but it's just one of those complex songs with a lot of elements that becomes readily identifiable with practice, but it can still trip you up and sound very remarkably similar to the fox sparrow. So all green-tailed towhee songs have these sliding whistles, and before this year I would have said they all have a mechanical trill element as well, and those two features combined are what I found most useful to separate them from fox sparrows. But then I saw and heard an individual that I would have sworn up and down was a fox sparrow, singing a song without a single trilled element. And that just tripped me up. So I'll play an example to show you now. So you can hear those multiple elements in there, and it's kind of a complex song with a lot going on. But those sliding whistles are useful to cue in on, and then you can hear that mechanical trill in there that sounds quite similar to the spotted towhee, just with more going on. Throughout most of the state, green-tailed towhees are at least relatively distinct from fox sparrow songs, but in the Sierra Nevada and along the California border, that does not seem to be the case. The fox sparrows here, mostly of the thick-billed subspecies, though not exclusively, can sound very, very similar to green-tailed towhees, and the best way I have found to separate the two is that they will generally add some mimicry to the song, the thick-billed fox sparrows will, and they generally use the same species to mimic. They'll often mimic American robins and northern flickers, but they will use others. Whereas green-tailed towhees throughout the state tend to be more stereotyped in their song, and they'll sing the same phrase repeatedly, though again, not always. So, let me play a recording for you. This is going to be the thick-billed fox sparrow subspecies. So you can hear that mimicry in there. Both robin and flicker calls were in various song phrases there. And then I'll play the green-tailed towhee for comparison here. So you can hear the green-tailed towhee is maybe not quite as rich and a little more hurried and frenetic sounding. And a quick note about the sonograms down below. Those are both clipped. That one below the green-tailed towhee is not that first song phrase. And the sonogram below the fox sparrow there is the first song phrase of the slate-colored subspecies recording that I will play in a minute here. But so back to this California northwestern area of confusion where these two birds can sound very similar. The best way I've found to separate the two is to listen for that mimicry, listen for repetition, and listen for patterns in the song phrases, but it's tough, and it takes a lot of practice. Fortunately, throughout the rest of the state, central, southern, eastern Nevada, I don't find them to be as difficult to separate. The slate-colored or interior west subspecies of fox sparrow sing a relatively distinct song with a distinct pattern, often with more rich whistles and less trilled elements, and always changing the song each time, compared to the hurried, fast, frenetic, stereotyped towhee. Again, those are generalizations, but patterns to cue in on. So this is going to be the slate-colored or interior west subspecies of fox sparrow, and again, that first song phrase does line up with that sonogram pictured below the bird. And so it is subtle, but you can hear how he is changing those song phrases each time. And they're just a bit richer than the towhee. And again, here's green-tailed towhee for comparison. So as is clear, these songs take practice to differentiate. They can sound very similar, but there are things to cue in on to distinguish the two, and with practice, it is possible. And just paying attention, and you'll always be learning something new about these birds' vocal behaviors and repertoires. The Abert's Towhee, on the other hand, has a much simpler vocal array and a much smaller distribution. They're a bird pretty much exclusively of the Mojave and northern Sonoran deserts. They're non-migratory, quite sedentary, in fact one of the most non-mobile species I can think of. Abert's towhees inhabit riparian areas with thick vegetation like this. They seem to prefer mesquite bosques and dense quail bush, but they'll use almost any patch of thick vegetation. I've even heard them calling from emergent grasses alongside rivers, like cattails. They're a plain brown bird overall, large and chunky like our other towhees. The long tail is readily recognizable as they dash about the underbrush, and they have dark lores that contrast with the rest of the face, that black right between the eye and the bill there, and the no contrast between the head and body, and then those rufous undertail coverts there. The only species I think of to mention as a possible confusion is the crystal thrasher, and obviously not if you have an ideal view like either of these, but almost more frequently you will see this long tail with rufous, rusty undertail coverts disappearing into the bushes, and with that view they can look quite similar. And in those cases, the best way to tell them apart is often vocalizations, though the crystal thrasher may be a bit longer-tailed and slenderer overall, but that's a tough thing to pick up on when it's disappearing into the bushes as you watch. So here I'll play some Abert's Towhee vocalizations for you. They form a very strong pair bond between the male and female, and one of the most common vocalizations you'll hear them make is this squeal duet. And this is both birds. I think of it as squealing in delight when they see each other. But it sounds like this. Perhaps the most common noise you'll hear them make is the territorial pip, and that's made by the male, and it serves as an advertisement in territory defense, and they will use this much more often than they'll use their song. And that sounds like this. And again, it's those sharp pip noises in the foreground, like a sneaker on a basketball court, not the white-winged doves and Gila woodpeckers drowning it out in the background. And I will play their song for you now, but like I said before, they use their song very infrequently, and potentially correlated with rainfall, according to Birds of the World. And I have noticed that they do seem to be singing more frequently on rainy mornings, or mornings it just has rained. So the song sounds like this. So they'll use those pip notes as intro notes and then kind of stutter into a little trilled song there. And again, heard relatively infrequently, produced by the male only. And this final vocalization they make is both male and female, and it's a seat call that at first sounds very similar to other sparrow calls, but with practice it is actually quite distinct in the field, and that sounds like this. So it's a quiet call, not very assuming, but it is definitely distinct and very recognizable with practice. So that concludes our presentation on Nevada's towhees. We only have 3 and they're quite distinct and easy to identify. I only briefly delved into the natural history here. There's much more info available online, so for those of you who are curious, you can find more information from a number of sources, such as Cornell's Birds of the World. Also, Abert has a wealth of photos and audio recordings, as well as range maps compiled from user data. So thanks for watching us, and stay tuned for the release of Nevada Sparrows Part 2, Desert Scrub Sparrows.